Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
In the Christian scheme of things, love and judgment, love and discipline are not mutually exclusive. They're two sides of the same coin. The problem is you and I live today in what is called secular humanism. And secular humanism would tell you, oh no, all you have to do is teach a person what is right and ultimately they will do it.
Today with Jeff Vines, pastor, apologist, and Bible teacher.
Hello and welcome to Today with Jeff Vines. In this episode, we're hearing from a series titled Raising Faith. This is a series designed to help our kids to be more like Jesus and less like us. Let's get into it now. Here's Pastor Jeff to begin today's message.
I'm in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1 through 4. I'm going to read that momentarily. And this may seem a strange way to begin a series on parenting. In fact, we're calling this series Raising Faith because the end goal or objective of a Christ follower is that their children may grow up in the fear of the Lord, that they may know who God is through a personal relationship of Christ. So we've called this Raising Faith, but that includes a lot of things that the parent biblically, concerning the Bible record, it concerns a lot of things the parent needs to completely and fully understand. Now, let me just say from the get-go that there is no such thing as a perfect parent in the same way there's no such thing as a perfect child. But parenthood is one of the most important functions or roles or places of authority in culture, because historically we've learned that society itself begins to destruct when the family unit is broken and when there are poor relationships, when there's estrangement between the mother, the father, and the children. So just keep all that in mind. And this might be an interesting way to start the series. But the first question I want to ask is, as you look around culture today, especially in the West, has lawlessness, again, this is an interesting way to start, has lawlessness increased or decreased in the last few decades? Are we better or worse when it comes to our society? And, everything you're going to read right now is going to tell you that we are less intelligent right now in this generation. Corporations constantly complain that their employees are unable to do basic math in their heads, basic thought, it's almost like they've been told certain things to think without coming to the conclusion or taught how to think and how to arrive at those conclusions. Are we more or less emotionally and mentally stable? Well, everything you read will tell you there's an epidemic of depression, anxiety, and other issues of mental health. In California alone, where I happen to minister, violent crimes has increased to 500 per 100,000. Now, that means that 1 out of every 200 people who live in the state of California are going to experience a violent crime. That's remarkable. And of course, the reason is because of an ineffective justice system. There's no deterrence. Punishment, we're told now, in our society, or discipline, does not deter crime. There is no real price to pay for law breaking. There's no real fear of consequences. Now I know it's an interesting way to start, but as parents who are following Jesus, there's something we need to desperately know as we approach parenthood, and that's this. Jesus' worldview is that love and judgment, or love and discipline, or love and correction are not mutually exclusive. And the most simple example that I give of this, and I'll expand it a little bit, is that if I tell my children not to play in the middle of the street, I don't do it because I'm punishing them or restricting them. I'm doing it because I want to save them. I want to protect them from harm. Now, if my children decide to disobey and play in the middle of the street, then there's got to be some form of deterrence that encourages them not to violate that law again. And if, for instance, if my son does something that I tell him not to do, and let's say I say, okay, go to your room, you're grounded for a week, you can't go out into the community, or whatever form discipline takes, I don't do it because I hate my child. I do it ultimately because I love my child. I am not apathetic toward the well-being of my children. In the Christian scheme of things, love and judgment, love and discipline are not mutually exclusive. They're two sides of the same coin. The problem is you and I live today in what is called secular humanism. And secular humanism would tell you, oh no, all you have to do is teach a person what is right and ultimately they will do it. Well, the Christian worldview says you're living in a dream world. In fact, this is the starting point, the foundation for this entire series. The secular worldview says that man is basically good, teach him the right path, and he will most likely choose to go that direction. And the key words associated with this type of thought are the words rehabilitate and reprogram. Now, you need to understand that view dominates much of the philosophy of a secular worldview, but it is not the philosophy of Jesus. Jesus' worldview says that the heart of man is wicked, that he has a disposition toward doing the wrong thing. He is self-serving, self-aggrandizing, and selfish. Now, that's pretty harsh. But the question is it true? In fact, Jesus would assume the heart of every child is not bent toward righteousness. Jeremiah 17:9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Mark 7, verse 21-23. For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lavishness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within inside the heart and defile the man. Unfortunately, most young parents today are reading books on parenthood that have a faulty starting point. The faulty starting point is this: your child is basically good and will always act accordingly when he or she truly understands what is right and what is wrong. Therefore, no discipline is required because discipline ultimately represses. Now, let's define what we mean by discipline. Discipline is defined as the practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment or corrective disobedience. Sorry, let me say that again. The practice of training people to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. Is there such a thing as wrong discipline? Well, of course there is. When I was in second grade, we had a teacher, Miss Treadway, beautiful teacher, but the parents of the students in the class that I attended were frustrated with their children not doing their homework, so they gave permission to the teacher to enact a type of corporal punishment, we're talking about back in the 70s, if the children didn't do their homework. Well, the problem is, I did my homework, so I was part of that class. And so she lumped all of us together so that we all paid the penalty for the willingness or unwillingness of the entire class to do their homework. Well, this caused me not to want to go to school. And I was a good student and I loved going to school because it's where I got to play on the sports field with my friends. But this caused me not to want to go to school and to lie to my parents and tell them that I wasn't feeling well so I didn't go have to face the music. That is what we call bad discipline. The opposite of wrong discipline, however, is not the absence of discipline, but right discipline. And a parent may say, well, how do we know what that is? Okay, that's the beauty of all this. What we're simply saying is you and I have grown up in a society. We're in a society right now that is anti anything to do with discipline, anything to do with correction. And we are told if we do that, we will repress the true personality and nature of the child. Jesus comes along and he tells us that the heart of man is wicked. All of our hearts are bent toward doing the wrong thing. And we're going to need some things in order to save the child, to point the child in the right direction so that the children can grow up in a healthy environment and move out into their world effectively. So in this one little verse, Paul gives a lot of information. Let me read verses 1-4 of Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So we've just read the Bible. Now, I've already said that there's going to be the world's way of doing things. And the Bible tells us that the wisdom of the world, or the wisdom of God, is foolishness to men. And we're told that part of that in the Christian worldview is that we would engage in three things. And I'll get to those in a moment. But Paul's assumption when he writes this is that parents stand in the gap between children and God. That the child is not old enough to have a full and mature relationship with God, so parents serve as God's proxy. So the attitude then behind obeying your parents is honor. Timao is the Greek word, to respect and hold your parents in high regard, so that when the child disrespects his or her parents, she, in fact, is dishonoring God. Moreover, if you know anything about the Old Testament, under the law of Moses, there were serious repercussions of dishonoring one's parents. But why? We never asked that question, and the answer was for the sake of society. Let me quote to you a recent study. We'll get to this in a moment, but let me preempt this study just a little bit. Here's the quote. A person who grows up with a sense of respect for and obedience to his parents will have the foundation for respecting the authority of other leaders and the rights of people in general. So when parents stop teaching and nourishing their children, and children stop obeying and honoring their parents, society, we're told, self-destructs. Now, again, quickly, as you look at society today, are we self-destructing? The answer, of course we are. Do you know that every year in America, there are 9 million serious assaults by children onto their parents? More and more children are being convicted for murdering their parents for no other reason than to oppress parental control, for money, for freedom, for autonomy. The article goes on to say in a Harvard study, when society tells our children that they can have or do whatever they want without restrictions, historically, those children will soon begin mocking their parents, teachers, moral standards, and society in general. A generation of undisciplined, disobedient children will produce a society, says the study, that is chaotic and destructive. Now, compare that with Proverbs 29:15. If a child is corrected, disciplined, they become wise. But a child who is not corrected brings shame to their mother. Isn't that interesting? If you think about it, have you ever been in a grocery store or public place where the child is just throwing a temper tantrum, throwing things at his mother, trying to hit his mother, and it just kind of disrupts everything? Everybody kind of stops and stares at how aggressive and how undisciplined this child is. But the reality is, when you look at a situation like this, who should feel ashamed, the child or the parent? Seldom do we look at the child as the problem. We know that something's happening or not happening at home, and the Bible tells us that brings shame because that tells us there's no discipline, there's no correction, there's no significant deterrence at home. Now, before we go to the remedy, let's remember what we've stated probably 3 or 4 times already, and that was the whole purpose of the introduction of this sermon and the foundation upon which we will build everything else. Most of the child-rearing books of our time begin with a faulty assumption. The secular humanist worldview that man is basically good, so if you show your child what is right, he or she is sure to follow. The Christian worldview says that a child's most dominant attitude is selfishness. His interest is totally self-centered. His own wants and needs are all he knows and all he cares about. Now, even most of the books today that claim to come from a Christian perspective have been infiltrated primarily by secular humanism. It's just the way of culture in the present time. What we want to do as Christ followers is kind of throw that to the side, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do. Just throw everything out, because let me tell you something else about parenting. Typically, you will go try to find a book that tells you what you want to hear, because your parenting skills either are a result of how you were parented or a result of doing the opposite of how you were parented because you didn't like it. So what happens is typically we go to find resources or books that agree with us. It's just human nature. So when we come to something that's so important, What we're going to do in this series is try to encourage one another to cast that aside and say, okay, according to the Bible, what am I supposed to do as a parent? And this is the beginning right here. I'm going to take you to a small passage of scripture that is filled. It's a treasure just from the get-go. It shows us once again, the Bible truly does know about life. Okay, so the Bible says this: fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. The way this passage is put together in the original language, first of all, fathers is pateros. By the way, that's a reference to both parents. Now, fathers might be the context, but this could be fathers, mothers. And this is the negative side. Here's what you don't do. Do not provoke. The Greek word is parozio or zidzo, which means exasperate, frustrate, irritate, anger, but that's still not enough. What does that mean? How does one provoke your children to anger, frustration? And basically, believe it or not, there is a relationship between provocation, the exasperation, with anger and with raising the children and discipline and instruction. So kind of hidden in this text is the idea that the thing that most frustrates a child is when right and wrong are unclear and when discipline is inconsistent. When right and wrong are unclear and discipline is inconsistent. So we're told, rather than exasperating our children and provoking them to anger, mature them how? In discipline. This is padia. And this is the word for systematic training. It's correction. Again, involved in all of these words is the assumption that if you have systematic training, and in that systematic training, there's a violation, a correction for the wrongdoing is always assumed. You know, a good example is in Hebrews 12, we're told that for those God loves, God corrects, God disciplines, God rebukes. And instruction. These two words go together in the sense that this is the systematic training of discipline, and it includes correction when the child goes the wrong way, and then instruction, nouthesia, great word. It's a reference to putting into the child's mind, verbal teaching. It's based on Deuteronomy 6, where as you rise in the morning, as you go to bed at night, as you walk along the path, you're always putting into the mind of the child what is right and wrong, not based on culture, but based on the Word of God. Instruction of the Lord, Christ worldview versus the secular worldview. So that's the general overview. Now, the question then becomes, if it's provocation, if we don't want to provoke our children, if we don't want to frustrate them, exasperate them, and instead we want to bring them up in discipline and instruction of the Lord, then the big question is, how does one provoke or exasperate the child? All right, so the research I'm going to give you comes out of two things. First, the Old Testament, a lot of the Old Testament precepts that God gave parents. But two, also, I'm trying to harmonize those with what we know with certainty about children in our own culture who have been raised a certain way and the outcome. So this research started around the 1960s and 70s. So now there's been enough time to develop to show how certain approaches to parenthood affect and impact the child. So here's what we know, and this is the gut of the sermon here. Stay with me. Number one, a child is exasperated when there are no clear boundaries. This breeds insecurity. Believe it or not, we know that kids want to know, hey, who's in charge here? And if it's not clear who's in charge, then they will try to fill the gap. What's interesting is they don't really want to because they know deep inside they don't know how to. And research tells us that a child, when there are no clear boundaries or when those boundaries are inconsistent, so they do something that you say is wrong on Tuesday, but they do it again on Friday, and they get away with it. There's no clear boundary. It frustrates. It actually breeds insecurity in the child and a lack of trust and confidence in their environment and in their surroundings. Now, let me give you a humorous little illustration here. First time I went to Nairobi, Kenya, I grew up, spent a lot of time in Zimbabwe, but Nairobi's a different experience because no one obeys the traffic laws. I mean, India's bad, But at least in India, when they pass and go around each other in speed, they still kind of stay in their own lane, or if they venture out, they'll eventually come back in. Not so in Nairobi. Every day at 5 o'clock, Nairobi locks up traffic. And the reason is nobody obeys the rules. No stop signs, no stop lights, and they drive on whatever side of the road they want to. So eventually, when you have enough cars, you've got cars on both sides and no one can go anywhere. This was so intimidating and frustrating for me that I got out of the car, which was stupid, and I started trying to direct traffic. Now, it worked. It took me a while, but I said, okay, you guys go there. It's just part of my personality. However, from then on, I didn't want to drive in Nairobi because I was terrified. I knew I wasn't qualified to do this, and it created incredible tension. What we are learning about children who are raised in homes where there are no clear boundaries, they develop this type of fear and trepidation. They become insecure and they feel unprotected. Number 2, a child is exasperated when discipline is inconsistent. Now, these two go together. In other words, laziness on the parent's part breeds frustration. The National Library of Medicine published a study recently, and it said inconsistent parenting is linked with children's conduct problems. Now, this is not the Bible, although the Bible would agree. The Bible would agree, but this is from a recent study, okay? And here's the quotation. A home observational study showed that mothers of conduct problem preschoolers acted inconsistently in disciplinary conflicts. Now, what are they talking about? Well, we're talking about a parent whose yes is not yes and whose no is not no. So we've all seen this. The parent says to the child, you have to eat what's on your plate before you get dessert. But the child doesn't, and the parent gives in. You have to take a nap before you can go to your friend's house to play. Child refuses to take a nap, kicks and screams, gets what they want. The parent is inconsistent. You have to do your homework before you can play outside. That's the rule that's set down. The child knows, though, if he screams or she screams and throws a temper tantrum, that somehow they can manipulate the parents and ultimately get what they want. The effects of inconsistent parenting, says the article, means your child will grow up with a lack of security because they believe they're in charge. And deep inside, they don't trust themselves. And 2, they end up developing attachment issues. They find it difficult to see the parent as a reliable source of comfort because of the parent's unpredictability. 3rd, they develop habits of manipulation and coercion and struggle to find meaningful relationships because the habit that they've learned is if I kick and scream, I get what I want. So they think they can do the same thing with other people. And if you do that with other people, you'll be ostracized and you'll have trouble developing meaningful friendships. And ultimately, the article says, inconsistent parenting creates a conflict between husband and wife. When I was parenting, Robin and I were parenting Sion and Delaney. Sion was clever. She also had a bent toward unrighteousness because if her mother told her to do something that she didn't want to do, she would come to me and ask me, not telling me she had talked with her mother. Imagine a child doing that. And then Robin and I would engage in a verbal conversation about what is appropriate in front of the children. We learned very quickly that is a mistake because then they knew how to work us against each other. And that in turn creates more tension, instability, and insecurity, and a lack of trust in the family unit from the children. Alternatively, the article says when parenting and discipline are consistent, listen to this, when there is consistency in the parent's actions and responses, the toddler behaves better. Consistent parenting also helps toddlers develop emotional security and trust, which also lessens, ultimately, misbehavior. Bottom line, inconsistent discipline frustrates and exasperates the child.
You've been listening to Today with Jeff Vines. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll bring you the rest of this message from Pastor Jeff.
Love is not mutually exclusive to discipline. There must be clear instruction and deterrence. Discipline must be consistent. Parents must show love for one another in the presence of the children. And you're getting the word and the ways of God into your child's mind. If you will start with that foundation and that understanding, that as you instruct, teach, and correct the child, you end up saving the child.
You can listen to more messages like this. Just search for Today with Jeff Vines wherever you get your podcasts.
You make me wanna dance and
Today with Jeff Vines.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.